All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate you all taking the time to join us today to learn more about the USNC and the IEC and how you can effectively participate in these activities. Before I hand this over to our speakers, we have three wonderful speakers today who will be sharing all of their knowledge with you. Before we turn it over to them, I'll just briefly run through today's agenda, the learning objectives, and a few other quick housekeeping items for you. All right, so hopefully everybody has had a chance to review the USNC constituency training modules. If you haven't already done so, we have the link here. We recommend that you take a look at these modules. There's 6 modules in total. You can find them on the USNC.
Cover slide. Sorry to interrupt you. I didn't advance a slide if you were advancing. There we go. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. Appreciate that. If you haven't already looked at the USNC constituency training modules, please take a look at the USNC Education and Training webpage. They're all up there. There's 6 of them, and they're pretty quick to go through. You can, go through them at your own pace, but it really gives you some foundational information about the USNC and IEC. Again, hopefully you've all reviewed that ahead of today's webinar, but if you haven't, here's the link, and definitely check them out when you get a chance. All right, so today's agenda, as you can see here, we'll touch on a handful of items. We'll briefly cover the history of the USNC and the IEC. We'll talk about how you can best prepare before the meeting. We'll talk about best practices during the meeting and then any responsibilities or follow-up after the meeting. We'll also cover technical positions, contributions, consensus, voting guidelines, and then finally, we'll do a piece of information about hosting meetings in the US and then allow for some questions at the end. So in terms of questions, we're happy to answer questions. That's a great part of webinars here. So we do have a little pause at the end of every section here that you see on the agenda that we can take questions that relate to that section. We'll also save some time at the end for any other questions that come up as well. So if you do have any questions, please do enter them in the chat and I'll be moderating that and raising those questions to our presenters today. All right, and then just briefly, the learning objectives. So we hope that you guys will take away a lot of information from this webinar, especially the importance of global cooperation and collaboration, a better understanding of how you can participate and the confidence in how to participate in standards development and conformity assessment, real takeaways as to how to cultivate international relationships and how to conduct yourself at meetings, a better understanding of the guiding rules and principles of international meetings, and then organizational relationships. So quickly, before I run through our presenters for the day, I just wanted to run through an opportunity for anyone who's new to the USNC. For those with 8 years or less of related experience, we do have this wonderful committee called the Young and Emerging Professionals Committee, and they put on a lot of engagement opportunities for people who fall into this category of the 8 years or younger of related experience. If you're interested in joining the committee or hearing about the activities that they're putting on, we do have the website here that can give you some information. And then we also encourage you to reach out to my colleague, Mac Connors. Her email address is here. And then I just wanted to let everybody know, because I know this will be a popular question, we will share these slides after today's webinar. So you will have a copy of this slide deck with all of the links in it as well. Next here, just wanted to give you all the contact information for USNC staff. So you'll have this as a reference. You may know some of us, you may not know all of us yet, but here's our full team. Feel free to reach out to us at any point with any questions that you might have. All right, and now to our presenters. These presenters, so I'm so thrilled to have the 3 presenters that we have today. I mean, the amount of experience that we have on this webinar today is truly outstanding. And I'm just so grateful and happy that we have this presenter group. I've listed them here in the order of how they will present today. So we first have Muhammad Ali. Ali is a member of the USNC Technical Management Committee. He's also a member of the USNC Communications Committee. He's an expert on the JSEG 15 and Systems Committee of Bio-Digital Convergence. Ali is joining us from HP, where he serves as the Senior Standards Strategy and Policy Leader. And another fun note is that Ali is also the chair of the ANSI Committee on Education. So he's very familiar with webinars and the education around USNC and ANSI items. Next, we have Elena Finger. Elena is very active in the USNC. She has been for a long time now. We're grateful for her dedication. She has been a member of the USNC Communications Committee for many years now, and she was a former chair, actually. She was the most recent chair of the Communications Committee. She's a tag member of TC86, which is fiber optics, and all of its subcommittees, and then is also a member of ISO IEC JTC1 SC25. Elena has a lot of roles at the IEC level as well. She's the Assistant Secretary of IEC TC86. She's a convener of TC86 Work Group 1, and then an expert on several 86 working groups. Elena is joining us from Corning today, where she serves as the Global Standards Process Coordinator. All right, and then our third presenter of the day, Jonathan Colby. Jonathan is a member of the USNC Technical Management Committee, the USNC Conformity Assessment Policy Coordinating Committee, USNC IECRE, so Renewable Energies. He's a member of many of our USNC standing committees, the Communications Committee, Finance Committee, Nominations, and Rules and Procedures. And he's also a tag member of TC 114, SC 8A, 8B, and then Systems Committees on Smart Cities Energy. So we're thrilled that we have Jonathan here. He has a lot of IEC roles as well. He is actually the chair of IEC TC 114. He's a convener of their AG1 and then an expert in a few TC 114 and 8A working groups as well. And then Jonathan is joining us from Streamwise Development. He's the president of Streamwise Development. So with that, I will kick it over to Ali, who is going to start us off with an overview of the USNC and IEC.
Great. Thank you, Megan. And just to confirm, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay,
Yep.
great. Thank you. And thanks again for USNC for arranging this webinar. It's a great initiative, and you to USNC staff for coordination. So with that, let me introduce you to the first topic, which is USNC and the IEC overview. So if you move on slides. So the three big I's, as we call them, IEC, ISO, and ITU, are the three international standards development organizations that develop standards in different fields. Today, we're going to be focusing on IEC. The IEC stands for International Electrotechnical Commission. It is a global organization that develops and publishes standards in the field of electrical, electronic, and related technology, which is collectively known as electrotechnology. And IEC is really old. It was founded in 1906 with about 89 member countries at the time. It's headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland. And its standard reach is over 150 countries by now. With that, I also want to just make sure that you understand the difference between IEC and ITU. So ISO, on the other hand, was founded a little bit after that, and ISO manages the standards in the development of quality, interoperability, ICT sector, and other sectors that are not covered by IEC. So there is a distinction between the standards developed by IEC versus ISO. And then ITU is uniquely positioned to develop standards in the telecommunication sector. ITU is a governmental organization, and it is developing standards in the field of telecommunication and radio communications. So with that, if we can move on to the next slide. So the structure of IEC. So the structure of IEC, as you can see on the screen, is a little bit complex, which starts with the General Assembly. So the General Assembly, you can think of it as kind of like a plenary, an annual plenary meeting for all the members of IEC. Now, the members of IEC are not individuals or the companies. The members of IEC are the countries, and that's what they call them, national committees. These are the national committees that are represented in this General Assembly meeting each year. That the General Assembly, of course, delegates the management and oversight of the work of the IEC to the board, as you see in the picture there. So the IEC board is the core executive body of the commission and reports to the General Assembly. Now, individuals on the board do have the responsibility to the commission as well as to all of its members, which are the countries. And then, IEC board has several committees as well. So it has the Business Advisory Committee, which coordinates the financial planning and outlook, oversees the commercial policies and activities, as well as the IT infrastructure in support of the IEC board. Then we have the Presscom, which is tasked to advise and support the IEC board on matters essential for the functioning of the commission itself. And then board may establish from time to time specific advisory groups to address matters that are not addressed by other bodies, or to provide advice to the board on a specific matter. Then we have as well, if you look at the bottom of the IEC board circle, you can see the Standardization Management Board. The Standardization Management Board is really the main one that managed all the technical standardization work of the commission. So very important body within the entire IEC is the Standardization Management Board, or as we call it, SMB. Then we have the Market Strategy Board as well, which is tasked with identification and investigation of the technological trends and market needs in the field of activity for IEC, as well as the Conformity Assessment Board, which manages the operation and financial aspects of the conformity assessment activities of the commission. And then, as you can see, the Secretariat is really the one who's managing the overall operations of the commission and providing the required support function that requires to fulfill the objectives of the commission itself. Then SMB itself, as I noted, is the main body that manages the technical operations of the committees themselves. So as under SMB, we have the strategic groups, systems work that happens at the advisory committees, of course, the technical committees, right, which is where many of us get engaged at. The technical committees can also have subcommittees, and then the subcommittees can also have other groups as well. And then, of course, the JTCs as well, right? The Joint Technical Committees, which not only report to IEC, but has two parents and reports to ISO and IEC both. So now we have two JTCs. We have JTC1, which is focused on the information and communication technology components, and then JTC3, which was recently established on quantum. So all that also comes under the technical committees of IEC. The Market Strategy Board can also have special working groups working on several different topics related to market trends and needs, as well as the Conformity Assessment Board has several working groups that I'm going to cover later on. But I just want to mention to you right now that it does have 4 working groups, and we're going to get into the details of that later on in the webinar. So hopefully that gives you a good idea of how IEC is structured. Let's now move on to the next slide. Yeah, so the mission and values of IEC. So as I noted it on my first slide, the IEC is really there to serve the needs of the electrotechnology community, right? So it develops standards, worldwide standards that are used by countries all over the world that not only ensure the safety, efficiency, reliability, and interoperability of electrical, electronic, and information technology, but it also enhances the international trade, facilitates broader access, and in general, enable a more sustainable world that we live in. So the work of the IEC community is really guided by its four core values: trustworthiness, inclusivity, independent, and progressive. So what does it really mean? So trustworthiness is really collaboration of the experts that are involved in consistent and robust processes and procedures. So IEC and ISO has the most robust standards development procedures that allows the experts to get their work done through consensus building, working together, and inclusivity. So that takes me to the next point IEC has the broad participation from all over the world, from public and private sector, from governmental organization, from SDOs, from consumers, and developing countries, all working together under a same mission to come up with one standard that is market relevant. It's, of course, independent, it's nonprofit, neutral, and working through consensus. And then it's continuously adapting to the evolving needs of the society. And that is why you see the groups that it has, such as Market Strategy Board and advisory groups and the business advisory committees. This is the reason that IEC is constantly evolving. It was developed in 1906 and it's still functioning. The reason for that is it's strong and structural, and it's continuously evolving to meet the demands of their national committees. So if you move on to the next slide, please. Then the question comes as to why should we really participate in the development of the international standards? What is the benefit that we get out of it? So standards, is this invisible glue that kind of puts everything together, make everything work together. And if they're not there, that's when we realize the true value of standards, right? So and international standards are really the one that are enabling the global trade. IEC, of course, produce most of those standards that facilitate the adoption of those globally relevant, globally accepted standards to promote the interoperability and commercial acceptance across the electrotechnical industry. It, of course, gives you the competitive advantage to participate in the standards development process, but it also can sometimes shields you from a competitive disadvantage by participating in standards development process. It gives you access to greater markets. Of course, you build customer confidence in your product, services, and solutions by complying with the international standards. It also helps you innovate and increase your capability in the R&D sector. And last but not least, of course, it reduces the overall cost of doing business by following the international standards. And if you move on to the next slide on the consequences of not participating, you can think of standards are as if markets are right here and technologies are here, standards are really that bridge between the market and technologies to kind of make sure that the markets, the different technologies can connect with the different markets that you have. And if you are not there at the table, your competitors will be there. Somebody else will be there that will develop standards for you. and then you will have to follow those standards, which may or may not be in your favor. Of course, there is limited access to foreign markets. If you don't participate in standards, which could lead to global inconsistency, and sometimes affecting the safety, the health, the consumer interests, and putting interoperability at risk. Of course, if you're also not participating in standards, you kind of are left behind in a sense that you don't know what's upcoming, and you are not best prepared to address that, or to basically make tweaks in your development process, in your supply chain process, to react to those when it comes. So it costs you even more afterwards to respond to those standards, because you're not aware of them. And by keeping up with standards development process, you not only get a chance to influence the content, but also to make sure that you can guide the internal processes, and make changes as you go along, to better prepare. So if you move on to the next slide, I'll introduce you to the USNC, which is why we are all here, right? The US National Committee, as we call it. The US National Committee is the mirror committee to the IEC, and is the official US member body of the IEC, that represents the US in the development, and the use of globally relevant standards for the electrotechnical industry. So USNC overall has over 165 US technical advisory groups responding to the different IEC technical committees that we have, or are a member of. We hold over 30 IEC chair positions, which are of course the leadership positions, and has over 25 IEC secretariats, where we provide the administration support to those committees. USNC also facilitates the assessment of conformance to standards via testing, certification, and accreditation. And of course, USNC is a committee of ANSI, American National Standards Institute. So if you move on to the next slide, I can go over a little bit about the structure of the USNC, which may not be hard for you to understand by now. Looking at already over at the IEC structure, USNC structure starts with, of course, the ANC Board of Directors, and then we have the Council, USNC Council, USNC Secretariat, which is, you already heard from a couple members from the USNC Secretariat today. And then we have the USNC Technical Management Committee, which is basically the mirror to the SMB. Underneath the TMC is where we have all the USNC tags, technical advisory groups, the VTAG, virtual technical advisory groups, and the US administered IEC secretariats. We also have a number of USNC standing committees, such as finance, nominations, communications, rules and procedures, young and emerging professionals. And then on the right-hand side, you see that we have the USNC Conformity Assessment, CAPCC, Conformity Assessment Policy Coordination Committee, which also responds to some of the working groups on the conformity assessment side, which I did say that I'm going to go over later on. So with that, let's move on to the next slide. This is just the list of our USNC officers. Our USNC president right now is Veronica Lancaster from CTA. Our general secretary is Ade, and then we have our vice president of conformity assessment as Joan Starling from NEMA, vice president of finance from Peter Pondolo from Corning, vice president of technical as Hei Choi from NEMA, and then we have our immediate past president as Kevin Lippert with ULSE. So we also have some individuals that hold IEC positions. We have IEC Vice Chair for Conformity Assessment from US as Stephen Margus. Stephen IEC Business Advisory Committee member is Sonia Burt from ULSE. Peter Pondolo sits on the IEC Governance Review and Audit Committee and is actually the chair of that. Megan Hayes is the chair of IEC Diversity Advisory Committee from NEMA, and Chris Kramer is the member of the IEC Market Strategy Board from UL Solutions. So if you move on to the next slide here, USNC participation in the IEC. The USNC interfaces with the IEC technical committees, the subcommittees, joint technical committees, and the systems committees via its mirror committees, or as we call them, US Technical Advisory Groups, USNC tags. So there's one USNC tag for each IEC technical committee, subcommittee, systems committee, or JTC, where USNC is a P member. P member means participating member. Of course, we are serving as an O member. We don't have a US tag because we are just observing, and then there are some where we are not even a member, right? So P members are the one that are where we are serving as a full participating member, and where we do need to have a USNC tag to establish US positions. So USNC overall administers over 170 USNC tags with over 2,500 experts. USNC tags are the ones that determines the US positions on the IEC documents for votes and comments. It designates delegates to attend the meetings for its IEC technical committees, subcommittees, systems committee, JTCs. USNC tags. USNC is the one that officially appoints experts to serve on different working groups, maintenance teams, and project teams, and also is responsible for submitting proposals for any new work items. And if you move on to the next slide. So, as I noted, the standards development process, or the heart of standards development process, is really consensus, right? We establish decisions using consensus in these standards development committees. And consensus in standards really refers to a process by which a standard is developed and approved by a recognized body such as IEC, ensuring that all views and objections are considered and efforts are made towards resolution. This process includes, of course, cooperation among different parties that are interested in the development and the use of standard. And in the standards development world, consensus does not mean unanimity. It has, it just basically implies that we have reached a general agreement that is acceptable to all parties that are involved. And we have made efforts to look at all the views and objections that have been come at our table and have made good efforts to address them. And the definition that you see on the screen comes from ISO IEC Guide 2. So moving on to the next slide, we have how does the IEC standards development process really work? You can kind of think of it as a project development lifecycle. And the key to standards development in IEC is remembering these steps that or these aspects of consensus building that will help you get through from start to finish, right? So it really starts with some research on what the needs of the standard is, why the standard needs to be created, gathering viewpoints of all interested and materially affected parties, having a discussion. There is no such thing as winning in standard. There is no standards development is really not possible without compromises, right? Compromises have to be made in standards, and you have to be able to negotiate and come to a consensus in a way that is agreeable to all parties involved sitting at the table, right? So once you have that general agreement, just like what I talked about, consensus is not unanimity, right? It's general agreement. And once you have the consensus on what the standard needs to be established on, the first thing, of course, is to come up with the scope of the standard, and then, of course, come up with its content, move through the working drafts, which really happens in the working groups, right? And that's an iterative process, right? You go through, you go back and forth until you come to a consensus where you are comfortable with moving forward. Agreements on those draft by voting, and then finally publication. If you move on to the next slide, because these are globally relevant documents, there are in some countries clause that can be inserted into these standards. And that is because IEC is an international standard. There are several countries that are involved in the development process of IEC standards development process. And the in some countries clause gives you the ability to insert the informative tax concerning the particular condition existing in your country, right? So these are the informative tax that could be incorporated into the international standard, and any statement of compliance with the standards requires compliance with only the normative elements of that standard, not the informative elements. So by having these in some countries clause does not impact other countries that it does not it does not apply to, right? The statement of the in some country clause is really provided by the national committee that is impacted by that change, right? And they are the one that should be providing this statement. If you move on to the next slide, this is usually provided at the CDV level, and in most cases there is no discussion or voting on the in some country clause. It is just incorporated in the text as it's coming from the national committee that is of concern. It is again an informative text, and any efforts, of course, that makes this that would make the statements regarding particular condition unnecessary should be avoided, right? That, for example, inclusion of the clause is not a reason for voting negative. If some country has included in some country clause, you cannot really vote negative just because they have added an in some country clause. And again, I would like to remind you that this is an informative content that has been added and only applies to the country of concern. So if you move on, like I said, I will come back to the conformity assessment piece of it. And conformity IEC has these 4 multilateral conformity assessment schemes. IECEE, which is the Systems for Conformity Testing and Certification of Electrical Equipment. IECQ, which is the System for Quality Assessment of Electronic Component and Associated Materials and Processes. IEEX, which is the System for Certification to Standards for Safety of Electrical Equipment for Explosive Atmospheres, or as they call it, ATEX. And IECRE, which is the Systems for Certifications to Standards relating to equipments for use in renewable energy applications. And using the IEC standards that are developed in different committees, those standards can be used for certification and conformity assessment processes at the national level to ensure that a product meets the requirement, has been tested to those standards, built confidence for the end users and the quality, and of course demonstrate the high quality of those standards. So there are different conformity assessment schemes that are working on different sectors, as you can see within the IEC. Okay, that wraps up the first section, and I'm not sure, Megan, are we taking questions right now, or should we move on to the next section?
Ali, I think if you want to continue on to your next section, and then we can take any questions at the end. We don't have any in the chat right now.
Okay, great. So let's move on to our next section, which is before the meeting, right? So next slide, please. Yeah, so before a meeting, you need to be able to appoint a US delegation that's going to these TC plenary meetings. And USNC tag is really the one that appoint a US delegation before each meeting. The goal of these US delegation for meeting is to essentially establish US positions, right, on agenda items that are there. If you move on to the next slide, the delegation includes delegates and the head of delegation. So the head of delegation is responsible, and one note I want to make is that the head of delegation cannot be a TC or SC chair. So if we have somebody within the USNC tag that is serving in that role, they cannot hold that head of delegation role. They has to be somebody else. Or similar to that, if somebody's serving in the secretary role, they can also not hold the head of delegation role. Delegates are really the members of from the USNC tag that are attending those meetings, the official representatives on behalf of the USNC for that relevant TC or SC, and the head of delegation is really the person that speaks on behalf of the entire US delegation. The head of delegations decides or designates other delegates as speakers from time to time on particular topics, depending on the expertise level and depending on where they need more information. And then, of course, the head of delegation may also designate a delegate to serve on the drafting committee on behalf of the US for coming up with the resolutions of the TC or SC meeting. So let's move on to the next slide, please. Experts to IEC working group, project team, and the maintenance team. So working groups are within IEC are the ones that are working on new standards, right? Maintenance team are the ones that are working on the standards that have already been published but are under revision right now. And project teams are really the ones that are special teams that are kind of working in a new area that is not just ready for a working group. It's a new field, new area that is still being developed, and on all of these groups, you are represented as an expert. You are representing your expertise in these groups and not necessarily the US position. So these are appointed you are appointed as an expert to IEC working groups, PTs, and MTs by USNC and by USNC tag in accordance with the policies and procedures of that USNC tag. So if you move on to the next slide, the effective delegates and experts, the effective expert, will be prepared to demonstrate competence in the field that they are working in, or they have expressed interest in participating. They usually will keep tabs on what is going on within the working group and provide input early in the development process to optimize results, and participate in all meetings, informal gatherings, and social events. On the other side, for effective delegates, which are the delegates that goes to the plenary meeting, represents the US viewpoints in a clear, concise, and a persuasive manner to uphold the US positions in an effective manner. If you move on to the next slide, we have the IEC documents that are kind of divided into two categories: unofficial documents and official documents. The unofficial documents are the ones that are coming from the working groups, right? The ones that are not ready to go to the countries for comments or voting. These are the documents that are just internal within the experts, and they are internal edits or informational documents, pre-drafts, working drafts, anything that is still being discussed within the experts themselves. Once it's ready to go out, then it becomes an official document, and the way you can think about official document is any document that is going out and circulated out to all the countries. And countries, again, are the national committees, right? So these official documents have these you can think of as names. Each document has a certain designated name, which is like NP for new proposal, DC for document for comments, and so on, like that. Committee draft for CD, CDV, and so on. And these are the documents that are published by the IEC Central Secretariat. They are published on the IEC main landing page of the committee, which I think most of you are already familiar with. So I hope that gives you a difference between, different documents that are posted by the IEC. Of course, the unofficial documents can be accessed by the IEC collaboration platform, which all of you has an access to once you become an expert on one of those groups. So if you move on to the next slide, please. Preparing for the IEC meeting. We have to be very careful for the deadlines to register for meetings and make sure that you register on time. The USNC technical advisor and the tax secretary usually calls a meeting of the USNC TAG to review US positions, strategize options, and develop a plan prior to an international meeting. So the responsibilities of the TAG members is to research their own organizational views on the different agenda items, have the data, information, and documentation available to support their positions, in order to establish consensus, keep up to date on the status of issues within the committee via tag minutes and communication from other tag members, and be familiar with all the related documents well before the meeting. Fully understand, of course, the critical issues and position of other delegates, and decide which US positions are not negotiables and which ones are not. Like I said, standards development process is nothing without compromises. So you have to be able to understand that you will have to negotiate, you will have to come to a consensus, you will have to make sure collaborate and coordinate with others. If you move on to the next slide, please. USNC TAG members should also make sure that USNC TAG consider taking on leadership position where it is strategic enough for US and where it's important. Familiarize themselves with the directives, because they are really the guiding principles of how the work should get done. And you can actually intervene and call upon any other national committee who does not comply with it. So you really have to make sure that you comply with not just the directives, but also review the IEC supplement of the directives to ensure how the work needs to get done within IEC. You should also familiarize yourself with the USNC procedures and your tag procedures if they're unique, particularly guidelines for voting. Learn as much as possible before the plenary meetings about the delegates that are coming into the meeting. It's usually a good idea to arrive at the meeting location a day or two before, especially if it's international, to just kind of get to know delegates a little bit, to get to know the location, to learn a little bit about the language. You have to be able to network in these meetings, and a lot gets done during those coffee breaks than the actual meeting place. So you have to utilize that, and in order to do that, you have to make sure that you give that extra time, you learn that language. For example, I'll give you a simple example of the business card. In US, we take business cards and just put it in our pockets. We don't, most of the time we don't even look at it. In other countries, it's actually disrespectful if you take their business card and just put it in your pocket. What the tip that I use basically is, I look at the business card, and basically if there are phone numbers, if there is a phone number written on the business card, I basically look at each number of the business card to determine the right level of the time that you need to look at the business card or the email, to ensure that I have given enough time to show respect to the other person, and basically look at that business card. Learn as much as possible, few words about the language if it's not your native language, the culture. Do participate on those social events. The social events can be a great place to build connections, to establish and strategize about which countries are allies, which countries have different positions. So when you actually go into the meeting room, you know exactly how to support US positions, right? If we move on to the next slide, please. Preparation for the virtual participation. Virtual participation during in-person meeting is at the discretion of the chair and secretary of the TCSC working group. And if no virtual participation is proposed for an upcoming in-person meeting, you can ask for virtual access if possible. After COVID, it's very rare that a virtual option is not made available. There are guidelines for virtual participation in IEC meetings, and that can be reviewed at the document that is provided in the slide deck, which will be posted later on. But virtual participation in almost all cases is made available in IEC committees. If we move on to the next slide, please. For preparation for the hybrid or virtual meeting, for hybrid meeting, USNC TAG members should request the chair set of rules of engagement if there are none that exist. Of course, maintain online awareness and define rules which will ensure that the viewpoints are properly taken, right? For exclusively just the virtual meetings, exceedingly long meetings should be discouraged. The maximum meeting time should be kept at 3 hours, and then the time zones should also be taken into account for all meeting attendees. Meeting security, this should be not a surprise to anybody after COVID that meeting security is something that should be considered, and passwords should be set. And USNC TAG members should set up a means of communication for discussion during the meeting, such as any kind of other platform that is separate than the one that you're using for the meeting itself. If you move on to the next slide, please. The virtual meeting times, these are some of the best practices for meeting times. When group members are distributed, 500 UTC, 1300 UTC, and 2100 UTC would be the most appropriate times to propose for the meeting. And then just make sure that meetings should not be held over weekends or during national holidays of another country. So with that, let me just summarize what the duties of the delegates are in your job as a delegate. If you move on to the next slide, Megan. Oops, looks like we just lost the screen. There we go. Yeah, so in your job as a delegate, you must have the support of the USNC, the tag that you are represented on, and your organization. Be informed of all the activities at the meeting and the critical outcomes. Have availability to you for the work that is needed to get done. You should also have strong communication skills, negotiation skills, the diplomacy skills. The soft skills are the very important piece to this overall job of standards development. So you need to be able to have those skills in order to be represented strongly. Be familiar, like I said earlier on, with the relevant rules and procedures. If you move on to the next slide, be aware of the IEC structure itself, the USNC structure itself. Be sensitive to the nuances of politics, negotiation, alliances, and cultural differences, just like I noted earlier on in the slide. Understand that there's no winning in the standardization, and there's nothing that's possible without compromises. Be in a position to advise the committee and subsidiary bodies on any point of procedures or drafting. Carefully review the strategic plan of the committee and propose rules for hybrid meeting and advocate for more favorable hybrid and virtual meeting times for the virtual US participants. With that, I wrap up the section on before the meeting and hand it over back to Megan.
Thanks, Ali. I appreciate that. I'll take a look here, see if we have any questions or if any questions come in through the chat. Otherwise, we can move on to the next section here and take any additional questions at the end of today's webinar. So I'm not seeing any questions in the chat quite yet, but I think we have one person's hand is raised. If you're able to unmute yourself and ask your question. Oh, did the hand go down?
There's a note, Megan, that Chris cannot mute himself. So
Christopher, can you hear us? You should be able to talk.
Can everybody hear me?
Yep.
Okay, thank you. So is it possible to go back to the slide that talks about working groups and unofficial documents? I just had a quick question in relation to that.
Sure.
Is it
Here
this
we
page
go.
you're looking for?
Yeah, I think that's it. So, I was just wondering, when members of U.S. National Committee Technical Advisory Group, a USNC TAG subcommittee, participate in a working group meeting of an IEC technical committee or subcommittee, and unofficial documents are generated during that meeting, which then appear on the IEC collaboration platform. Um, if if those USNC tag participants are not experts, but say for example they are, as in my case, a consumer advocate, and they're participating in the working group meeting as a delegate or guest. Um, how do they get access to the unofficial documents on the IEC collaboration platform? My understanding is that when the documents are placed on the IEC collaboration platform by the convener, that the permissions or roles only allow for the experts that participated in the meeting to access those documents. Is it possible also for delegates or guests to access those documents?
So that really depends on the USNC tag that itself. You know, each USNC tag can make a decision on whether you know, they can grant access to that or not. So I would say, you know, check with the policies of the USNC tag as well as the technical advisor.
Technical advisor. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the TA has to set you up. You still have to be an expert for the IEC to allow you permission to get into that collaboration tool area.
Okay, but they can set
So
me up
you
for that.
can't do that unless someone has named you to that committee. So as
Yeah.
a guest, a designated guest or an observer, no, you wouldn't have access, but you might be able to ask the tag leader if you could have, if they could forward you some of that information, because it is a matter of the IEC granting permission because you're a member, it's not entirely up to the tag leader.
Okay. So I should reach out to the tag leadership then
Yes.
Yes.
for an initial, I guess, discussion, and then perhaps they might have to also verify it with the IEC itself.
That you'd have to be named by the U.S. National Committee as an expert
As an expert.
in order to get access directly.
Right.
If you need direct access. However, if you're there as an observer or a guest, I'm sure that someone could share something with you that, you know, after, but not through the collaboration tools directly.
Right. You mean through like an email link?
Through the tag itself, that
Or an
the
attachment.
tag leader would have the documents and possibly share them with you.
Right. Okay, fair enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
Looks like we have one more question online. We'll take this last question and then move on to the next section. Pragnish, I'll unmute you and you can ask your question. Go ahead, Pragnish.
Sure. I have a questions regarding USNC YEP committee. So can you please go to the slide?
There you go. You should see the information here.
Yeah. So it says that committee encourages professors with 8 years or less experience to participate in the work of USNC IEC. Now, particular my background, when you say 8 years, 8 years is a total experience, or is it 8 years of the experience with USNC?
8 years or less in standards. So you could still be a 20 years technical expert in one area, but if you have been participating 8 years or less in standards, then you still would come under young and emerging. If I'm not mistaken, Megan, correct me if I'm wrong.
That's absolutely correct. Yep, you've got that right.
Okay,
Yep.
okay.
So
But
if
if
you're
I am,
interested in, oh, go ahead.
yeah, so if I am with CSA committee and IEEE committee for over 10 years, then means, you know, I'll be not a part of YEP committee at the US. I'm new to USNC, but I'm very familiar with IEEE and I'm very familiar with CSA.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can definitely reach out. I think you fall under that, 8 years or less of experience with USNC and IEC. And we can connect you with, upcoming events, and you can see if that is something that you would think would be helpful to you. But yeah, definitely reach out. I think it would be great to have you involved.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you, Mohammed.
Absolutely. All right, I'm going to bring us down to, sorry for the big scroll here. I'm going to bring us down to our next section where we will have Elena present. So taking me a minute to get there. All right, so now we should be seeing the during the meeting slides. So we'll kick off this next section here. Elena, I will pass it over to you.
Thanks, Megan. You can forward to the next slide. Ali prepared you very well for what to do pre-meeting and actually touch on a few things that I was going to touch on during the meeting, so I'll spare you a little bit. What we'll talk about here is, so you've prepared yourself, you've gotten all your stuff together, the tag has met, you pretty much know the positions, and now you're going to go on and attend the meeting either in person or virtually. Forgive me if I don't touch on virtually too much, because that is its own animal, but a lot of this has to do with being there in person. And so I'm going to approach it that way regarding it, like, for example, a delegation meeting before the committee. Your tag probably will have met, at least hopefully will have met prior to the actual meeting. So you'll be able to talk to those people. If you are in if you were at an IEC general meeting, the USNC will host a large delegates meeting, which I strongly encourage you to attend and participate in. You'll get to meet a lot of the people that you've been interacting with in the USNC, as well as members of your tag that you may not have met face-to-face before. So do that and get any last minute plans together if you can with your delegation that is just going to your technical committee or subcommittee meetings, or to meet with some of the other members of the working group that are from your national committee. I also encourage you to get in good with some of the IEC committee officers. That could be anybody from the IEC itself, so you'll know you'll get to meet your technical officer that is assigned to your technical committee or subcommittee. You also can get to meet the chairs, the secretaries, the conveners of the working groups, socialize with them as well. Very important to know who they are in advance of getting into the meeting if you can. Also, we ask you to volunteer to serve on committees. That is, of course, as long as you have the support of your company and the USNC, because it may take up a lot of your time and you may want to know in advance that you'll be able to do that kind of a thing with your company's blessing. So prior and during the meetings, you want to make sure that you read the written resolutions, daily reports, comments from the chair or from other officers to make sure that they reflect the USNC's understanding of the actions that were taken. And I can't stress this enough, and we'll see it again in some of the other slides. The written record is going to be what counts. So it's not going to be what you hear and what you remember about the meeting. Check the notes. make sure they have everything in there that you needed to capture and that they're captured correctly. Again, with taking leadership positions, strongly encourage you to do that as long as you have the backing of the USNC and your business, your company. Moving on to language. IEC's official language and all the meetings that are taking place in the IEC should be held in the official language of English. Make sure that it's being conducted in English, but note that the convener may ask for a small break so that other people who are not native English speakers from other national committees may be able to discuss things in their own language and then come back to English later. English, for most of the people here, is their first language, may or may not be, but you're used to dealing in English all the time. Some of these people only get to use their English when they're at these meetings. Give them a little slack. It's not their native tongue. If you've ever been in that situation, you could be suffering from a headache for a day or two while you're getting acclimated to listening to only English and having to participate in English. Also, make sure that the group that you're participating in is aware of the online participants during hybrid meetings and following those rules for virtual participation, acknowledging the people on the audio and or video to make sure that they have ample opportunity to participate and to contribute to the meeting. Moving back to the English question, get your point of view across briefly. I can't stress this enough. Try not to give long, elaborate talks, but when it says quickly here, it doesn't mean to speak fast, because you have to keep in mind that English is not necessarily someone's native language. Preferably in advance of the meeting, find out who is your ally and who is your adversary for certain points that are going to be taken up in the meeting. And then consider where you're going to sit. And that could be a strategic plan where you could, especially newer people, might want to sit together with people that share their point of view so that you can talk or, compare notes during the meeting. However, it might be strategically to your advantage to have your allies planted around the room so that it's coming from different areas in the room. And that will be up to you and to the people that are your allies to see which works best for you. But note that it might change depending on some of the culture of each group. And each group's culture can be different. Next slide, please. As Ali had mentioned, make sure that you are willing to express your point of view, but be willing to compromise. So establish your contingency plans in advance, but note that you might have to think on your feet if something unexpected comes up. Be very determined in your position if you can't reach a compromise, but try your best to reach consensus, noting that that's not necessarily going to be unanimity. And I like to define it as consensus being everyone is equally unhappy, but something that you can live with. Then as a new person, you might consider having an ally that can more effectively make your point known. Some groups are much more willing to listen to somebody who's established in the group rather than somebody who's brand new. And it might make you feel more comfortable if somebody else is able to express your position. Also note that some delegates might be expressing their own personal opinion, not of those of their national committee. Now, in a TC or SC meeting, you can challenge that and say that, it sounds like it's coming from the point of view of that person or that person's company. But in a working group, as Ali mentioned, or a part, a PT or an MT, you are not necessarily representing the USNC, although you were appointed, but you could be representing your business at that point. You can be asked to produce data to justify a position and or consider bringing examples of products so that you can illustrate your position. And those can be helpful in getting points across. If you're traveling with someone as a travel companion, as an accompanying person, encourage them to attend social events and to get to know the travel companions of other delegates. It's very nice to be able to socialize outside of the meeting as well. And that helps you to form relationships that help you in the meeting. Next slide, please. Be aware of timing, that yes, there are certain national committees that may be using delays to further their own goals, but also, and sometimes we might be doing that too, but you have to be aware of that somebody might be trying to delay something. There are deadlines. With some groups set up a deadline that is well in advance of the meeting for a contribution to the agenda. And that if they have done that and other NCs are trying to add new issues before the meeting, know the rules and object if it's appropriate. Some allow contributions up until the very end. So in groups I've been in, it has been more loose. In other groups, there is a definite deadline before you can put anything in. But there might be new work items or any new business sections on the agenda where anything could go. Make sure that critical issues are put into the agenda earlier in the day rather than later in the day. Ask the convener or the secretary to move things around if it's helpful for you. They might or may not be accommodating. If there is a 2-day meeting, see if you can defer and carry over the important items to the next day if it is too late in the day to start discussing things and people have already started either tuning out or leaving. The next one is very important. Coffee breaks, comfort breaks, etc. Can be used, and an effective convener or secretary will call a coffee break or a nature break at convenient times if something is getting contentious in a meeting. A lot of these things can be solved in the coffee hour. I've seen arguments break out in a meeting that are solved and brought to a good conclusion during a coffee break when people can discuss more informally and one-on-one and come back and have a resolution that's ready to go into the meeting. In my opinion, most of these breaks have been advantageous. I guess they could be detrimental, but you can always check those out and make sure that you use them to your advantage if you can. Next, please. So, effective delegates, which you will be if you've prepared in advance. Act in cooperation with the representatives. You can use your allies very well during these meetings. Relationships can be very valuable to you personally, as well as professionally. Every time I go to a meeting of my technical committee and its subcommittees, I feel like I'm going to a family reunion. Many of these people have been working in these groups for years and years and years. And you get to see them and have very, very nice discussions, and you have been in contact with them in between meetings as well, and you get to know them very well. Look at the attendance roster beforehand, see if you can identify allies and points of influence, so you can be represented with the other delegations. It's nice to be able to find your friends. Then always remember that you might be working on one document where somebody is your ally, but they could turn into your adversary for the next point on a different document. So it's important to know who your allies are, who your adversaries may be, and be ready to pivot because they may change. Next. always remember that you are representing your company and you are representing the U.S. National Committee. That you should show the utmost respect for the delegates and experts from the other countries. Be sure that your terminology is correct while you're speaking and while you're listening, using those worldwide terminologies that have been agreed upon. Listen to everybody's suggestions and their contributions, and be aware of any sensitivities in the region that you're at or with the people that you're working with. As Ali had mentioned, try to get to know the culture of country that you're going to be in and the culture of the people that you're dealing with in the meetings. So watch for that. Don't insult people. Be careful not to make statements about the US being the best, the most, the first. Don't be an ugly American. Try your best to be respectful and attentive to the culture of others. Certainly don't want to make yourself, your organization, ANSI or the USNC have to make apologies for you. Don't discuss disagreements between the delegates in public, and don't argue or even imply that other countries should accept a position just because it's the US view. Strongly suggest that you read the IEC Code of Conduct before the meeting and refer to it during the meeting if you need to, because it gives information on how to conduct yourself during the meetings, but it also gives really good information about conduct on social media, antitrust and anti-competition issues. Sorry, I forgot to turn my camera on. And that there's patent rights and everything else included in there. So I would suggest that you pay careful attention to the Code of Conduct. Next slide, please. And Ali touched a little bit on the talking versus hearing versus listening and the soft skills. Listening is a skill that requires a lot of patience. You have to do comprehensive listening and critical listening. You want to understand the message and you want to be able to evaluate the message. And this means paying very, very careful attention. As we've mentioned, you're not necessarily talking to a native speaker. If you don't understand, don't be afraid to ask them to repeat what they've said in a different way and explain, I'm sorry, I didn't understand what you had to say. If you could please reword that so that I can understand it. Pay attention to all communication cues, which includes nonverbal language, watching the person, seeing the person's posture. Limit your own talking. Make sure that you are not jumping ahead and thinking of what you're going to say next or finishing someone else's sentences for them because you think you know what they're going to say next. It's not necessarily true. Don't use unnecessary words. Don't be flowery in your language. Speak in what is called global English. You can look that up online. And be patient. Concentrate on what everybody has to say. Next slide. Okay. One of the other things that you can do is once the person has finished talking, repeat it back in your own words, the way that you've heard it from that person, and make sure that you get buy-in from them. This is what I heard you say. Am I correct? Go ahead and then see if you have heard what that person has had to say. Use feedback that you understand and elaborate if you need to. Avoid jumping to your own conclusions until the person has finished talking about what they need to talk about. Establish a rapport. Make eye contact if you're there in person. Try to stay in tune with the other person. And then just because a person has heard you, don't assume that that person is also in agreement. I found out early on when I was attending meetings that just because somebody from Japan says yes while you're talking does not necessarily mean that they agree with you. It just means that they have heard you. So don't assume that yes means agreement. Assume that yes might just mean, oh, I understand what you said. And then specifically ask if they agree. When you're participating virtually, just try to find out the established rules for hybrid meeting in advance and be patient and respectful waiting for your turn to speak. But make sure that you're able to be heard before that happens. And I will say, Ali touched on this a lot, and I would very much encourage you, and you'll get the link when you get the presentation, to read his article on global mindset for standards development in the USNC current from spring of 2021. It talks a lot about the soft skills you will need that help you become a more effective participant. Next slide. Do we have any questions now, Megan?
We don't have any questions in the chat right now, so if you want to go ahead, you can move on to your next section, and we'll see if any questions come through at the end of that one.
Okay, that's great. Thanks. Next slide then. Megan? There we go. So after the meeting, you want to review the official report of the meeting. As I said, make sure that the written word reflects exactly what you remember and that it has captured the points that the US has made or you have made in a working group or in a plenary. The written record is what stands, and that's what will be referred to. And your memories will not be taken into consideration. They're going to point back to the document and the decisions and actions that have been taken during the meeting. If you don't feel that a chair has carried out their responsibilities, make sure that you don't vote to extend the term of office of that chair. And you will note that also from possibly the reports or possibly the conduct at the meeting. As I said, social relationships become very important in these standards meetings. Consider maintaining personal contact with delegates that you've met, holiday and birthday mails and cards, whatever. Just help to establish a relationship that you have. You can help people from other countries visit the US and invite them to meet with you if you can. And keep tabs on what is supposed to happen. And if it doesn't, submit an official inquiry through the USNC office. Some committees will review the report of the meeting during the meeting, especially they will go over decisions and actions taken. Provide corrections if something is not clear or if something you feel has not been accurately captured. Next slide, please. Reporting back home, there's, as Ali mentioned, there's a designated head of delegation that has to fill out an HOD report. That report then becomes the official record for the USNC of the meeting. There is a form that gets filled out. You will have links to the form in this presentation so that you can review it. That report should summarize everything that need to be known from the meeting, successes, challenges that were made to US positions and opinions, see what was accepted, what was not, and their potential effects on US. So that kind of thing is going to be in its original form, or excerpts can be put into article USNC's current newsletter. And please feel free to do something like that, or to note that something is of interest more broadly that might be expressed in the current. Next slide. Make sure, again, decision lists and reports from meetings to make sure there's most current information and as well as their accuracy. And then as far as, let me see, I'm sorry, excuse me a second. if you review any of these lists, you want to look at any of the international standardization things, communicate the results of the meetings to the industry and the public, the USNC and ANSI through regular reports. These are two types. So sometimes there'll be public communications and announcements to the trade and technical periodicals and professional journals, but also there might be private communications within the TAG or the USNC and your own supervisor at your company. But just make sure that you've attended this meeting, you've been supported to attend this meeting, make sure that you report back when you get home. Next, please. We talked about unofficial documents and official documents already. And we talked about the collaboration tool. Make sure that if you have access to the collaboration tool that you are on the notification list. If you've been notified that something has been added to the collaboration tool, make sure to check it out and make sure that it agrees with what your memory is and what the US position is. And then the official documents will be circulated by the IEC. The USNC makes them available to you through the tag. So you can get them yourself with your USNC IEC password, which would be given to you beforehand, but that only allows you to download certain documents. If you need documents from other committees, the USNC can assist you in getting those, as can the tag administrator or leader. So that should be enough for you to gain access to anything that you have to have or that you feel would be useful or of interest to your committee or your work. Next. These reference materials and source documents have been updated and links will be provided to you in the presentation when you get it. Make sure that you familiarize yourself with those before the meeting and refer to them if necessary during the meeting and after the meeting, of course, too. And I believe that's the after the meeting wrap up. So if anybody has any questions, please feel free to ask. Anything, Megan?
I'm not seeing anything in the chat just yet, and no hands raised. We'll give it just 1 second, and then I think if nothing comes through, we'll move on to Jonathan's section. So thank you, Elena. Appreciate that.
Great.
All right, still not seeing any questions coming through, so I think we'll jump into the next section here. We have Jonathan Colby, who will be speaking to technical positions, contributions, and guidelines for voting. Go ahead, Jonathan.
Yeah, thank you very much, Megan. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you great. Thanks.
Okay, very good. Well, greetings, everyone, and thank you all for joining today. It's a pleasure to be here. As Megan mentioned, I'm Jonathan Colby, chair of TC 114 and a number of other roles in the US and at the IEC level. And I'm going to first talk about technical positions, contribution guidelines for voting, and then I'll finish the webinar today with a section on home field advantage. So next slide, please, Megan. Now, where I would like to start for this part of the webinar today is on a transition that the IEC is undergoing. Hopefully, most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with the IEC's new online standards development tool, or the OSD. The IEC has been piloting the OSD for the past few years. And as we note in the first bullet, beginning in January of 2025, the OSD will be the default tool for all new IEC projects. For those who maybe are not familiar with what this OSD tool is, it is a total shift in the way we write standards within the IEC. Until present, as many of you will know, standards are written through the exchange of Word documents or other similar formats. Changes are made by email exchange and obviously writing in person in meetings. Those documents are issued in PDF form for National Committee comment, and those comments are returned. And we'll talk more about the traditional method in the next few slides. But the IEC is transitioning to a fully online platform that allows for real-time collaboration and sharing, similar to a Google Doc, if you will, or some of the other online document editing platforms that are existing. My own technical committee, TC 114, has been involved in the OSD pilot since the beginning. We have published one standard using the online standards development platform. And as of today, 80% of our standards in our work program are utilizing the online standards development tool. And it's my goal explicitly to get to 100% of our standards. When the final two in our work program are published, we will be at that 100% mark. And then again, beginning in January 2025, the platform will be the default tool for all new IEC projects. There are a tremendous number of resources available from the IEC to familiarize yourself with this new platform. We've got 3 links here that you can access once you get these slides. They do, and I think that's the next slide, but then there are also a couple webinars coming up that are really important to share with you. The first is that on the 9th of October, tomorrow, they'll be hosting a webinar on the release of the OSD 4.0. So if you're interested to learn all about the newest release of the OSD tool, there's a chance tomorrow at 10 a.m. Even more exciting, the U.S. National Committee is hosting a webinar for U.S. experts on OSD training. You should have received an email from Megan yesterday with a link for registration for that webinar. That webinar will be on the 7th of November at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And thanks, I think, Ade, for putting some of these in the chat as I'm going along. Next slide, please. The IEC also recently developed what they're calling a sandbox. So you can go in and practice commenting and using the OSD platform in a simulated standard so you can get some experience. And then as mentioned, there's also a monthly training and feedback session. They have these dedicated for both the experts and the TCs, but also for the NCs or the national committees. So again, there's a tremendous number of resources out there for you to get up to speed on the OSD. I'll just sort of remind that any existing projects will remain using the traditional format after the 1st of January. And so if you and your TC are starting a new project between now and December, and you do start using the existing process, that would continue using the existing process after the 1st of January. But again, for any new project that starts after the 1st of January, the goal is for the OSD tool to be the default platform for developing standards moving forward. Next slide, please. So again, I'm going to go to sort of the traditional model, and I've talked with the staff at the USNC. In future webinars, we'll do some catered content around OSD, as it will be more integrated into the development of all new standards. But for now, since the OSD is still in this transition stage, we'll talk a little bit about the sort of existing procedures that we use. So when it comes to developing US technical positions, you need to remember that they should be developed in accordance with your tag model operating procedures, or if your tag has adopted unique operating procedures, you need to make sure that you follow your own tag's unique operating procedures. And so the message there is you need to follow your tag's rules for developing U.S. National Committee positions on documents that are either for vote or that are coming up during a meeting in person or virtually. Now, it's been touched on, but decisions should not be taken on items that were not posted to the agenda in accordance with prescribed timelines. U.S. delegates must follow the established procedures for the establishment of consensus positions within the U.S. If something was introduced directly at a meeting or did not meet sufficient timelines for preparation in the meeting, it is appropriate for a delegation to call for the consideration of this item via correspondence, and that would be done in the meeting. And so you can raise your hand and say, look, this did not meet the rules for document distribution, and as such, we'd like to remove this from the agenda during this meeting and instead have it done by correspondence. I would note, as an example of English, kind of touching on what Elena mentioned, maybe everyone knows this, maybe not, but the word table actually means 2 different things in American English versus British English. In the US, to table something means to not discuss it. So we would say, I'd like to table that item, and it means to take it off the agenda. In the UK, to table something means to add it to the agenda. So again, some of those sensitivities around the differences in language and using, as Elena described, a global English is really encouraged. And a final note on this slide, each tag is allowed to define their own quorum requirements. And so as you're preparing for a meeting and as you're making and establishing positions, make sure your tag is following its unique quorum definitions for voting and consensus building. Next slide, please. So for the USNC, I think many of you know there's a process called a new work item proposal. US proposals for the initiation of a new work must be approved by the tag and, where appropriate, publicly announced in ANSI's standard action for review and comment prior to the meeting. Such proposals for a new work item may be based on an appropriate American national standard, could be based on other generally accepted standards, or a rationale or standard under development. And so for those familiar with the new work item proposal, you need to include either an outline of the standard that's proposed, or if it's sufficiently developed, you can include a committee draft for the new work item proposal. Recently, they have adopted a fast track process, which would enable a basically finished standard to proceed directly to DTS or draft technical specification, but that would require some significant work beforehand within your technical committee to make sure that everyone was on board with that. And generally, you want to give a chance for comments on a document before you start voting to approve a document. We mentioned that the current template is used for commenting. For those that have seen it, it's a Word document that have very prescriptive columns. It's noted that these changes cannot be made to that commenting template. All communications, whether it's comments or votes from the tags, need to be sent through to the USNC office. Now, again, in the OSD, this will change slightly, but as it is now, paper or PDFs or Word documents that cover comments or have the voting results of a particular tag must be sent to the USNC office for them to transmit that onward to the IEC. And in the new work item proposal, you also have to note any copyright or intellectual property issues, and those must be respected for any standard that's developed. Next slide, please. Voting. Note that formal votes are decided by the majority of votes cast by P member delegations. Only one vote is allowed per delegation, which in person is cast by the national head of delegation. We note that special attention must be paid to negative votes, and every attempt should be made to achieve consensus. There are some unique voting rules on a new work item proposal. You need 2/3 of the P members voting to approve, and you need a certain number of experts to be appointed for a new work item to proceed. For other voting documents, such as Q documents, a simple majority is sufficient. Next slide, please. So there are guidelines for determining a U.S. voting position. Whether or not a national standard exists, if no U.S. consensus has been established, the recommendations are to abstain. If a vote from the U.S. is negative, it must be accompanied by reasons and supporting information such as technical data and a logical argument. It's also noted that any known exceptions or additions that will be required to conform with U.S. safety practices or regulations should be noted in the voting results. Thank you. Next slide. Now, there are some specific guidelines for determining a U.S. voting position if a U.S. national standard does exist. We note that if a national standard can be considered equivalent to the requirements in the international document, it's recommended to vote affirmative. If the international document includes different additional or more stringent requirements than in the national standard, and the U.S. consensus indicates that such requirements are acceptable and should be considered for inclusion in the national standard, you're recommended to vote affirmative. If these additional, more stringent, or different requirements are not acceptable, you're encouraged to vote negative. Now, the flip of that is if the national standard includes different additional or more stringent requirements than the international standard, and the U.S. consensus indicates that such requirements should be modified in the national standard in accordance with the international document, you're encouraged to vote affirmative. If those national stringent different requirements must be maintained, you're encouraged to vote negative. But if they must be maintained, but the proposed concept or document is considered to represent the best agreement which can be attained at the present time from an international point of view, the guidance is to vote abstain with a statement that the US cannot modify its national standard for stated reasons. Next slide, please. Now, if no national standards exist, then a US consensus establishes that the international document is technically acceptable and could be used as the basis for the development of a national standard. You're encouraged to vote affirmative. But if the international standard is not technically acceptable, you're encouraged to vote negative. Now, if the international document is of little or no interest to the US, you would be encouraged to abstain. And I think a very important one, number 3, if the international document unnecessarily creates barriers to domestic or international trade or impedes innovation or technical progress, you are encouraged to vote negative. Next slide, please. Now, as we mentioned, there is this electronic voting system that currently exists. Again, this will change as we move to the OSD, but for now, this is the model that we're operating under. So all tag votes on new work item proposals, committee drafts for vote, or first draft international standards are conducted via the IEC's electronic voting system. The USNC office is the one who officially submits all of those votes and comments via this system on behalf of the tag. The tags are all recommended to provide votes and comments, all tag recommended votes and comments must be submitted to the national office 1 week prior to the voting deadline. And we do want to note that the National Committee may submit an abstention if votes or comments are not received by the IEC due date. And there is a note here that a National Committee can lose its P member or participating member status for 12 months if it fails to vote on a regular basis. And so we really do encourage all of our P member tags to take your voting responsibilities seriously, as well as your attendance at plenary meetings. Both of those criteria, attendance at meetings and voting on documents, are requirements of P members and are sufficient grounds to lose your voting status if you are delinquent in those 2 areas. Again, all comments must be submitted currently on the IEC commenting form, and this form should not be altered or changed in any way by the USNC tag. Again, this will change as we move to the OSD, but as you're working in the current system, just a reminder that you must use the IEC commenting form and it cannot be altered or changed. Next slide, please, Megan. Now, I think that's the last one. I noted one comment in the chat. The OSD is that no attachments can be used. I don't really understand what that means because I don't exactly know what an attachment to a standard is. If you want to provide attachments or relevant material, that would be done inside of the collaboration platform, which is the online repository of documents, minutes, agendas, reports, other technical standards that are relevant. That would be done inside the collaboration platform. The projects tab, which is where you access the OSD platform, is also housed in the collaboration platform. And so when you're in collaboration platform, you should be able to see all of the ancillary and associated documents, the membership, and the OSD project portal where the actual writing of the standards would be used. So apologies, Richard. If that's not what you meant, I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about or clarify what you mean by no attachments can be used. Very good, Megan. I think we can move on. Again, the OSD is the tool that I'm very excited about. There are some kinks to work out. The IEC, I feel, is being quite responsive to those kinks. There's lots of online tools. The USNC will be hosting a training in November, and we'll see how the rollout goes in 2025. But, you know, I'm happy if anyone wants to reach out to me afterwards. I'm available and happy to discuss the perspective of TC 114 on the OSD. So our last section, and we seem to be doing really well with time, which I'm pleased about. is what we're entitling Home Field Advantage. So next slide, please. The first few slides here are about holding meetings in the United States. And the next few slides after that are about the value of holding US leadership positions. So regarding hosting meetings in the United States, the USNC is the official host for plenary level meetings of technical committees, their subcommittees, systems committees, etc., that are held in the US, and the USNC is solely responsible for their effective conduct. Now, the US delegation may extend a conditional invitation if the TAG and its administrator agree, with the understanding that the US National Committee will submit an official invitation to the IEC committee officers subsequently. Now, hosting a meeting in the US has a number of benefits. It allows a larger number of US delegates to participate. It highlights some of the technical areas of activity in the US, and it really establishes the US in that sort of leadership and leadership role in driving the standards forward. We do encourage announcing the intention to host as early as possible, as oftentimes delegates from other countries may need to obtain visas, and that can take time to process. I know in my technical committee, we try to have meetings identified 1 to 3 years in advance with at least a venue. And then within 6 to 9 months, we try to formalize the exact dates and location. But we do try within at least 12 months to have a meeting host and country identified, as well as a general time frame, maybe if not the exact dates of the meeting. And then when you're hosting in the US, we really encourage everyone to schedule meetings to your best advantage. Choose a time and location that coincides with events that showcase your strengths. Another anecdote from my particular technical committee, we always also try to do a technical tour or some kind of educational or sort of industry initiative. And so when we're looking at host locations, we also try to look at what technical areas related to our committee might be of interest. Sometimes it's a tour of a test facility. Sometimes it's a tour of a manufacturing facility. Other times it's a tour of a university and their infrastructure as it relates to the particular topic of interest. And so that's another item that we encourage people to think about is making the trip worthwhile for your delegates. Next slide, please. So now if you're hosting just a working group meeting in the US, this is an informal responsibility of a host for the national committee. And so in this case, the national committee is not normally the host. Instead, a working group member, a national trade association, or an interested company would volunteer to host the working group meetings. Again, when you do host working group meetings, you want to make it a multiple day meeting if possible to justify the travel. And you want to choose a time and a venue that of course works for your membership, but also seeks to take advantage of what's going on in the US. And so that would be to ensure a maximum participation of US subject matter experts on the working group. Hopefully there would be some type of example or exhibit that could be added on. I mentioned a technical tour, some type of tour, some type of exhibit. And then, we also always try to encourage networking opportunities. I know in our technical committee and in our working groups, we often have a no-host social event, which is usually a dinner. The host would make the reservations, but each of the guests would be encouraged and asked to pay for it themselves. Obviously being sensitive to people's dietary restrictions and other needs, but it's usually quite a nice addition to a meeting is to have some type of dinner or some type of technical tour or event or both to really, build some of that camaraderie that Elena and Ali talked about, to sort of make that culture of trust and inclusivity among the working group members. We find that these social events and these educational events are really important in building that trust that ultimately leads to building consensus and to writing effective standards. Next slide, please. So yeah, just some last advice on planning for hosting US meetings. Significant advanced planning is required for hosting meetings. I mentioned we do try to plan at least 1 year in advance at the TC level. I can tell you right now in the US, the tag to TC 114 is already beginning the planning for a meeting in 2026. So we're starting about 2 years out for the planning of that meeting. Obviously, the first step is to secure or identify a target date, a location, the appropriate funding necessary, and any administrative support that you may need for that meeting. As the days get closer, you want to send that written email request to host the meeting to the General Secretary. Ade is our General Secretary at the moment, and so you need to email Ade informing her about this request and including the information that step 1 has been completed. Then once you have approval from the USNC and they're ready to move forward, the USNC will extend an official invitation to the technical committee or subcommittee officers for their final approval and acceptance confirmation. And as I mentioned, the final approval with final dates and final notice of issuance is needed no later than 6 months in advance of the meeting date. And we do encourage that to be even earlier, if possible, just to make it easy for delegates traveling from far away. Make sure that people have plenty of time to arrange for visas and get their travel arrangements squared away. And there is a note that the IEC sets up all meetings, including face-to-face or virtual, at the plenary level within the meeting registration system. And then all experts attending, whether face-to-face or virtually, are expected to register via the meeting registration system. If you have any questions, you can contact the National Committee team. I know for TC 114, we have hosted 2 TC 114 plenary meetings in the US. One was in Boston and one was in Seattle. Again, we're planning for the 2026 already. And it is really a valuable exercise to host meetings in the US. And it really can accelerate and sort of enhance the US visibility in your particular industry. So next slide, please. So now we'll just have a couple quick slides about the value of home field advantage in leadership in terms of providing leadership and guidance for the IEC's activities. So to remind, the secretariat of a committee is the national committee assigned responsibility for providing technical and administrative services. So that is an organization or a national committee. For TC 114, that's in the United Kingdom, and they've assigned that to the BSI. The chair is responsible for the overall management of the committee, including some of the subcommittees and working groups. Then the secretary is the person who's assigned by the secretariat to provide the actual services on a day-to-day basis. And so again, for TC 114, our secretariat is the UK, with Mr. Danny Peacock from the BSI serving as the secretary, and I serve as the chair. Now at the working group level, we have the conveners who serve as the chair of the working groups. We have the project leaders who manage individual project teams. Then you have the subject matter experts that are appointed to the individual working groups, project teams, maintenance teams, etc. And then most committees have liaison representatives that can be from either internal IEC, they could be from ISO, or from other international organizations that are relevant technically to the work of your committee. Next slide, please. Now, so the benefits of the US holding the secretariat position are multiple. So it obviously establishes the USNC leadership in that relevant sector. I think a very important note that people may not know is the secretariat actually nominates the chair of the committee. There is a call for nominations and there can be an election if there are multiple candidates nominated. However, the secretariat has the ultimate responsibility of nominating the chair. And so that is a very valuable position of power as the secretariat. And as the secretariat, you provide the management and administration of the committee. It establishes the US in a position of influence. You're directly involved in managing the work program. You're directly involved in preparing the meeting agendas, and you're directly responsible for providing interpretations of rules and procedures. And when the US has the secretariat, it provides easier access to USNC leaders and stakeholders. That USNC secretariat or US secretariat understands the US concerns, issues, and interests, is able to speak the same language as the participants and constituents. You're usually in either the same time zone or within a few time zones, which makes it much easier to work with your US stakeholders and constituents. And as the last line says, you're literally always just a phone call away, possibly even a face-to-face meeting away, if you're in a major city and some of your key stakeholders are in that same city as you. And so there are many, many benefits of the US holding secretariats in the IEC. Next slide, please. I think this is my last one. There are value in both holding the secretariat or being a tag administrator. But we did just want to note that there are some costs associated with holding the secretariat or the tag administrator. At the international level, there are direct expenses, including staff time, obviously whatever office equipment and supplies you need to hold that international secretariat. And then there are significant travel expenses as you are expected to be at the plenary meetings and any other large meetings that are being held at the IEC level. Some other benefits include you get to nominate the secretary. There are chances within your organization for education and training opportunities. You are required to provide annual international activity assessment to ANSI, and there would be ANSI membership fees. Now for the tag administrator, there are similar costs. Those are again direct expenses, staff time, office equipment and supplies, and then domestic travel, because your tag usually meets face-to-face at least once a year. There would be the cost associated with any training and education opportunities, any annual international activity assessment that's required to ANSI. And then as a tag administrator, there are ANSI membership or equivalent tag administrator fees that must be paid. And so just wanted to summarize that, there are these costs associated with holding these key leadership roles, but the benefits are there for sure. Okay, and with that, I think that's my last slide on home field advantage. I can just tell you as the chair from the US, it's significant value to the United States. I know the US Department of Energy, as well as the US National Committee, is very pleased that I hold the chair. And it does really elevate the marine energy sector globally by having me as the chair of TC 114 from the United States. So 7 minutes to spare. Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Ali. And thank you to the USNC for giving me the chance to speak today. And thanks to everybody for joining.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'll just check the chat to see if we have any questions that came through. Doesn't look like any so far. No hands raised at the moment. We'll give it just a minute here in case anybody has any questions that they're typing in. Otherwise, if you have any questions that are lingering after this webinar, feel free to reach out to USNC staff. You can email me, we'll get you a response and connect you with any resources that would be useful to you. So not seeing anything. Oh, wait, nope, not seeing any questions come in the chat. So I think with that, we might end a few minutes early today, but thank you to all of our presenters today for joining and sharing their experience and their knowledge about the USNC and IEC. And thanks to all the participants who came and dedicated a couple hours of their day to learning more about our organization. We hope that everyone who's attending the IEC general meeting, either in person or virtually, has great sessions. And we look forward to working with everybody moving forward. So thanks again and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.